Well, for our speaker this evening, it's been said that in Christianity, every sinner has a future, and every saint has a past. Well, I can think of a lot of saints who would love to have a past like our speaker this evening. Tom Stewart, who you might know as the owner of Olde Sport Gallery. It's one of those places that you can just get lost in for hours and maybe never buy anything, or quite too often buy too much. Anyway, I'm sure you know him that way. But did you know that he is a lifetime PGA member and a professional golfer? He has competed, taught, and written about the game in more than 35 countries. In the off-season, he has worked with Mother Teresa of Calcutta. He's traveled as a citizen diplomat to the former USSR, that's nice to say, and helped develop hospice and anti-drug programs in the United States. He's hiked the Himalayas and in New Zealand, and he ran for U.S. Congress in 1984. Anybody know what state? That's right, Michigan. Okay. Someplace north of here. So, I hope you will welcome with me tonight a speaker that I wish we all had several hours to spend listening to his stories. Tom Stewart.
Well, it is an honor to be here, and I'm always happy to come and share a story or two. But first of all, another round of applause for the blessing of that music. It was incredible. I can tell you that if Phil Mickelson had come here on Wednesday last week and listened to that instead of putting for 4 hours, he might have played a little better than he did. And I've had a lot of different experiences in a lot of different churches, but there was a story I recently received from a gentleman on my email. It used to be it took a long time for jokes to travel around the world. There was a story about an atheist that was walking through the woods, and he was communing with nature, smelling the flowers, listening to the birds, and he was walking along, and pretty soon he heard a rustling behind him. It turns out a grizzly bear was coming down right upon him. And with that, he started to run, and he got about 20 steps. And he fell down, and the bear stood over him, about to finish him off with this big paw. And lo and behold, he yelled out, "God help me!" This is an atheist. And sure enough, a bright light appeared, and a voice came out of the sky and said, "Excuse me, but do I know you?" He said, "Well, maybe not." He said, "Are you one of my flock?" "Well, not exactly." He said, "Well, why?" The voice said, "Why are you calling on me?" He said, "Well, I'm in kind of a pickle here, and I didn't know who else to call." He said, "Well, let me just say, are you willing to become a Christian if I help you?" He said, "Well, under the circumstances, that would make me a real hypocrite. Could you make the bear a Christian?" "Yeah," the voice said, "Sure." With that, the voice went away, the bright light went away, and with that, it's just the atheist and the bear. And with that, the bear knelt down on one knee, put his big paws together, and said, "Dear God, bless this food which I am about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen." So in any event, I grew up in a big family in a small farmhouse. 6 kids, animals to milk, to feed, and there was a lot of commotion. My mother was an RN, my dad was a mailman, and we cooked on a wood stove. That took a lot of work, a lot of chopping wood and everything else. But when I walked out of that farmhouse, which I often did to get away from the commotion And there was a little more alcohol in the house than we would have liked to seen from my dad. He was a wonderful human being, but it made it tough sometimes. But I could walk out of my house, in that farmhouse, 10 miles from Petoskey, Michigan, and walk on property that human feet had never touched before. That's an interesting concept to think about today, where we all live. It's pretty hard to put your foot on a piece of ground that somebody hadn't walked on. But walking through those woods gave me an inspiration that at once wasn't religious, but it was spiritual. And, as I walked through those woods, much like that atheist, I had a little different effect on me. I began to see that there was an order to the universe that wasn't always necessarily in my house. And it gave me a great sense of peace. And I was brought up in the Roman tradition. And, it's a pretty disciplined religion. I was an altar boy. We had to fold our hands and got our hands wrapped if we didn't put them exactly the way it was. And but you learned and you meandered through. And I'll never forget, we had a lot of statues in a Catholic church. And the one on the top I thought was God, but it wasn't. It was St. Francis Xavier. But as a little kid, I thought that was God. Well, I'll never forget, it wasn't a pleasant-looking person. I mean, it was pretty frightening. And so God, to me, became something that was out there. Well, then, one day I'm serving as an altar boy, and if any of you remember the days when they used to put a paten under your chin when you were given communion so that God wouldn't fall on the floor, and occasionally if you got next to your buddy, you'd kind of flip his Adam's apple and, have a little fun with that. But this one day, I was about 12 years old, and the priest was handing out communion, and one did drop to the floor. Well, I went down to pick up that host, as we called it then, the transubstantiation, if there are any old Catholics in here. And lo and behold, I went to reach for that host, and the priest, an older man, karate chopped me. And he said, "You cannot touch the body of Christ. This is only for a priest." Well, that made me even more frightened of God. I mean, this is, something that, if he's that important that I can't touch him, then, what relevance is he going to have in my life? Well, fast forward through, college and going through college and, still, entertaining a very spiritual part of my being. I mean, I'll never forget, I had a throwaway class to take, and Sister Susan was one of the nuns at Aquinas College. And Sister Susan, the reason we all took it, she had been the homecoming queen at Michigan State and become a nun. Now, we don't know the reason for that, but we all took her class. Well, the best I ever heard in my house was a little, country western and, some other stuff. Well, she put those headphones on me, and the first song I ever heard was Pachelbel's Canon. Well, my life kind of changed. I mean, this was an inspiration to hear Pachelbel's Canon coming through my head, and that took me to another level of appreciation of art and music and the rest of the stuff. And when I got out of college, I was accepted at law school and didn't have enough money to go, so I said, I think I'll become a golf professional and see if I can make enough money to go back to law school. Well, as luck would have it, I had been the night waterman at a 9-hole course in northern Michigan called Walloon Lake, and I got to play every day with Tom Watson and his older brother, Ridge. Well, and I had been working at Week-Wetonson Golf Club in college, and I got a call from Ray Watson, Tommy's dad. He said, "Tom, would you like to work here next year as our golf professional?" I was still a junior, rising senior in college, and I said, "Sure." Well, I think I got paid $7,500, but it was the perfect job for a golf professional, Memorial Day to Labor Day. And lo and behold, it was great. It got me my start in golf, and I'll never forget giving golf lessons. My driving range was right along the side of a lake, and I wasn't smart enough to take the right-handers down to the other side so they wouldn't slice all the golf balls in the lake, because I could give, in those days, $15 golf lesson and lose money. Half the balls went in the lake. But one day he came to me and he said, "Tom, you worked at Week-Wetonson. There's a shoeshine boy there." Well, that boy happened to be an 82-year-old man by the name of Herbie Flowers. and Herbie was the black shoe shine man at that club, and he said, if we give you shoes, because I lived in Harbor Springs at the time around the bay, would you take him to shine them? And I said, sure. Well, the next day, 40 pair of shoes showed up at my doorstep, at the club, and I'm wrapping them up and driving on the way home, which took about 30 minutes in summer traffic. I said, $5 a pair, 40, that's $200. I made more money that summer shining shoes than I did as the golf professional. And it was a lesson for me that it didn't matter what it was, I could do it. And then I went on, got out of college, and played in a few tournaments, and in the winter, then I was offered a job in Lakewood Shores in Oscoda, Michigan. And I was mentioning to Pastor John that, this was I was making, they paid me $19,000 to be the golf professional, brand spanking new club. Nobody'd ever been there. They were building houses like crazy. It was a summer resort, second home for a lot of people in Detroit. And I was there, and then I found out that real estate agents selling that property were making $40,000 a year. So I said, you know what, I'm going to get my real estate license. So the next year, I made $20,000 as a golf professional, and I went in the previous winter, got my real estate agents, and I made $38,000 selling real estate. And so that was a lot of money. You think about 1971, I was flush, and I'd had no money to my name at all. So I went to a friend of mine, Scotty Caddo, who was a dear older mentor friend of mine. I said, Scotty, I'm giving up this golf business. This real estate is too easy. And he said, time out, pal. He said, what you don't realize, the only reason you're selling that real estate is because you are their golf professional. I was teaching their kids and their wives, and he was right, and the place went bankrupt 3 years later, and so I was back, found another great job as a golf professional. But something happened to me there. I went from having absolutely no money to having $60,000 as a 23-year-old kid. And, the first thing I did was went out and bought a nice car, and back then you could buy a chalet on Lake Huron for $11,000, which I did. Now, you could put your fist through the wall, and it had a crawl space heater, but nonetheless, I did that. And I found out that in the process of making this money and becoming, we were hosting tournaments. I had the Detroit Lions up there playing, and J.P. McCarthy was the voice of the Great Lakes. He was up there. He was one of my members. And people from General Motors were coming up there. And, I had everything that a kid 23 ought to have. But in the process of it, I'd forgotten who I was and had lost a little bit of my way. And one day I was in my chalet, which I said was kind of thin. And this was during the height of the Vietnam War, and there were B-52s coming within what seemed like this far from the roof of my chalet. And one day there was a storm out on the lake that had come in unlike anything I'd ever seen. And sure enough, one of these B-52 lights that were coming back from Vietnam, I swear it was going to come right in the loft where I slept. And for some reason, I was terrified, and I got down on my knees, and, as I said, all my religion was formalized, and it was kind of at arm's length. And all of a sudden, I got down on my knees and said, if you're out there somewhere, somebody like that atheist, help me out. I'm in a bit of a pickle here. And lo and behold, I went to an Episcopal priest who had been a priest, played for the Boston Bruins, John McDonald's great Nova Scotian, one of my best friends. And I went down to explain my experience of how I somehow had changed because of the recognition that I needed something outside of myself. He had ministered to a dying man the night before, and John McDonald had been an Episcopal priest for 20 years and had never really become a Christian. And here are two buddies that are sharing an experience that you can only have, in a certain kind of an exploration. So lo and behold, John and I started working together, and as a result of that liaison and that coming together of this spiritual experience, we were lucky enough to start. This was in the height of the Vietnam War, and we had a Class C school in Oscoda, Michigan, that had more drugs in it than any place else, because drugs were coming over from Vietnam like crazy, and it was selling. This was a town of 6,000 people, and it was an epidemic. So John and I started going out into the high school, reaching out to some of these kids, and we started this thing called Faith House. And, you know, we kind of know what we're doing. There was a guy named Barker down in Fort Lauderdale who started a place called The Seed, which had become very, very successful at bringing kids, using peer pressure to bringing kids off of drugs, and worked for a couple of people, of my friends. And so we started something similar, and it worked for quite a while. But it was an eye-opening experience. But sure enough, fast forward, in between relationships, I was single till I was 45, and so I'd had a couple great relationships, and in between a relationship that went somewhere because I was overseas trying to play golf, I wandered into the monastery down at Gethsemane where Thomas Merton lived and wrote. Wonderful spiritual place, and I wrote my first book from there. Actually had an inclination thinking that I could become a Trappist monk. Actually, there's a lot to recommend it, especially if you're without a girlfriend. Now, there was a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, I was one short. Now, and it's not the one you think. I knew all about poverty. I grew up in poverty. I had way more chastity than was good for a guy my age. It was that damned obedience. You want me to pluck what chicken? No, so I left there and went back into the golf business, and had some great experiences. Played part of the Asian Tour one year in 1979 before anybody knew who Mother Teresa was, although there was a book that was written about her by Malcolm Muggeridge, the English writer, and I read that, and because Calcutta was our last stop, it happened to be the 150th anniversary of the Royal Calcutta Golf Club, the oldest club outside the UK. And so I said, I'll stay an extra week and attend that tournament. So I did, played there, and when that was over, I went to visit Mother Teresa. Having been a hospice volunteer in Michigan, I said, I'll go look at this home for the dying called Nirmal in one of the worst slums, the Kalighat slum in Calcutta. And lo and behold, I showed up at this mass at Mother Teresa's convent or home, and lo and behold, I go up for my communion, and by now we're putting the communion in the hand. You don't have to take it through the mouth, so you don't have to. And she put that communion in my hand, and I had a flashback to that priest that karate chopped me back in there, and so I ended up. I was going to stay a few days, and I was then going up to the Gulmarg Club in Kashmir and Srinagar, where it was the second oldest club, and I had a chance to go there. But I ended up staying there for 2.5 months, and for a good part of that time, I was her driver. She came one day when I would show up, and she said, "Do you drive?" I said, "Of course, all North Americans drive." So I probably should have said I didn't. But here I am in Calcutta, India, driving a car through the most congested streets you've ever seen. And the first thing she said, "Look, just don't hit any of these cows running around here. You can hit some beggars or something, and you might not get in trouble. But if you run down a cow, you're in real deep trouble." Well, I can tell you that having gone into that place, I can point to everybody here, including Richard Payne, who's a chaplain of his own. If he walked in that place, he'd still be running. There's a certain grace that comes over you when you walk into a place where, literally, our job was to pick people off the street and give them a place to die in dignity. We would shave them, cut their fingernails, give them medicine, feed them, then go up on the top and wash out their bedclothes, the sheets that they would sleep on in these cots. Well, as I said, I wouldn't have had the capacity to do it. But the minute you walked into that door, there was something that was given to anybody that dared walk in there, that you did it. Not only you could do it, you did it willingly, and you got some joy out of it. And that goes back to what Mother Teresa used to say, is that unless life is lived for others, it's not worth living. And I can honestly say that, there were young kids, and who did you prioritize? Who did you give the biggest piece of fish to? Who did you do this? Because some were going to die. You would pick some of them up one day, and the next day they would be dead. And you would haul them down to the river to be burned on the pyre, and that was just part of the routine. But you do that for 2 months, and your life's going to change. And I can tell you, I never worried about a 3-foot or a 6-foot putt after that. And any of you that have played with me know that I hunt for some of my drives. And, that's not the worst thing in the world either, although I am getting better, Les, so watch out. And so, when I finally got married, I went to help build the first golf course in Moscow in Russia, and I needed a translator. So a Pan Am pilot of mine, I said, I need a translator, and he recommended this Russian flight attendant named Ilana. And lo and behold, when I brought the first 10 Russian kids here, she was standing, sitting, waiting for the same plane. I didn't know who she was, and I looked over, and this very attractive woman is sitting there. And sure enough, when the Aeroflot plane came in, she stood up, and I stood up. We greeted him, and she was my translator. And, we were both dating somebody at the time, but lo and behold, I went back to Russia the next summer to teach the coaches and their kids how to play, and I had brought the Russians here, and we'd struck up a friendship, and she came to there one day, and we got on a train to go to Riga, Latvia to get out of play, and we've been together for 23 years, so that was a real love story out of something that you could have never planned. I prayed for a great mate, but, it finally came true. And but bringing up the Pinehurst, I'll never forget, again, having grown up in the the Roman tradition, I would take my young son, who I think was 6, and I used to carry him up to communion in the Catholic Church, and he said, Papa, can I have one? And no, not in the Catholic Church. You got to go through communion service and all of this sort of stuff. You got to be trained to receive this. Well, when we came here, I went to the Catholic Church, and God bless them. It's a wonderful place. A lot of my friends go there. But I went up to receive communion, and the person who was in charge 18 years ago said, how do I know you're a Catholic? Well, I immediately said, Adam qui laetificat juventutem meam quia tuus, the altar boy prayers that I'd remembered from when I was a kid. But it kind of didn't excite me that you had to have a degree of some sort to get in there. So we started coming here. And lo and behold, I brought my son up to the communion rail. Don, you might have even been here because it was a bit of a stir. My son came up, he knelt at the railing, and the pastor gave him a host at age 6. So we're starting walking back, and he says, Papa, I got one. I said, this is my kind of place. So, but, I mean, this is stuff that, you can't make up and you can't laugh. But, I've been the luckiest guy in the world. I've been able to travel all over the world, and I meet a lot of great people. I gave Gorbachev the only lesson he ever had, and he wrote me this beautiful 2-page handwritten Cyrillic letter thanking me for hosting these 10 Soviet kids and coming back and doing that. And, of course, my wife translated it into English, but underneath I put a P.S., thanks, more importantly, for giving me the idea of tearing down the Berlin Wall, which I think I had as much to do as anybody. I was there more than Reagan or Bush was. So, but any event, I do feel like the luckiest guy in the world. What we carry inside of us, I tell my son, who just graduated from North Carolina, that in today's world, it's easy to find satisfaction and pleasure. You can find it anywhere. You can buy it. You can, do any of it. Joy is a different thing. Joy is something that you carry inside, and it's something that you absolutely have to work at. I happen to be drawn to silence and quiet, even though my business is with people all day long. There's a certain time every day that I'll get away to that quiet place, which we hear about so often, be still and know that I am God. And for me, that is getting into silence and appreciating silence. And I've tried to tell my son that if you can learn to meditate and intuit that higher part of yourself that speaks to God, the ineffable, call it whatever you want. It's in all of us. We just happen to be practicing in a Christian church, but I've seen it in Buddhist monasteries. I've seen it all over. And I think part of the problem that we get in religion is that we tend to name everything, and in politics and everything else. It's easy to label something and dismiss it. But if you can learn to accept what is in each of every human being that walks the earth, you have a better chance of understanding what it is that moves them, what it is to move each one of us, and it's different for all of us. And you can look in the New Testament, it will say, I think 47 times, Jesus went away by himself to pray, by himself. And though we can congregate, and we all do, and that's good for all of us, it's also great to have that quiet space in your own life and in your own heart that you can access, because I've told my son, whenever you're in trouble, if you can access that quiet place which speaks of God or whatever you conceive God or Jesus to be, and that's my tradition and that's where I come from, but if you can reach that quiet place, you'll have a chance to solve any problem that ever comes your way, and you will find that joy which goes beyond all understanding. Thank you very much. I appreciate this chance, Pastor John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you get away, I would like to thank you and give you this gift from the Village Chapel as a token of our gratitude and esteem. Thank you. I'd love to hear more about your fascinating life. And I think what's needed, perhaps, is someone like Mel Gibson to produce a film of your life. I'm afraid he might be too old to play you, though. Well, as a benediction, considering your association with Mother Teresa, who we know might remember died on a week, in August of '97, when nobody really paid much attention to it, because someone else died that week as well. I'd like to close with this. And maybe you've heard it. It's entitled Anyway. People are unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you are successful, you win false friends and true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. What you spent years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People really need help, but may attack you if you help them. Help people anyway. Give the world the best you have, and you'll get kicked in the teeth. Give the world the best you have anyway. That's from Mother Teresa. Words to live by.